city itself really should be a platform or a resource to allow people reach their highest potential.
Hi, and welcome back to the show. I'm your voice of choice, Johannes Riegler, and you are listening to the first episode of the third season of Cities Reimagined. Today, I have the Irish lad Donagh Horgan on the show. Donagh is a social designer, a researcher, and someone who's deeply involved in making cities more creative, resilient, and fair. Donagh is currently based in Rotterdam, where he lives with his partner and a greyhound dog, and works at the Inholland University, looking at how tourism and placemaking can help create better urban places. He also teaches at Erasmus University in Rotterdam and works with cities all over the world, and he will tell us all about that, and helping them tackling big challenges and rethink how they grow and change. Donagh is actually originally trained as an architect, but as he will tell us today, he's actually not designing buildings anymore, or not so much of that, but something else. Urban tourism has really exploded over the last 15 years, especially since the 2008 financial crisis. And cities turned to tourism as a way to boost their economies, but it's come with big challenges too. You might be aware of all the platforms like Airbnb and this kind of platform urbanism, which have made it easier to visit cities, but they've also pushed up rents and taken homes away from local residents. And a lot of communities have ended up feeling left out of this story, out of these, often marketed as success stories, treated more like a backdrop for visitors than being real partners in shaping urban futures of the neighborhoods. And that's why it is so important now to think differently about tourism, not just chasing numbers, but supporting a kind of regenerative tourism, where visitors actually help strengthening the places they come to, connect with the local community, and it's about bringing in the voices, the histories, and also the everyday life of the communities, and making sure tourism gives back rather than just taking away. So I was very happy when Donagh reached out when he was in Vienna for work to meet, and which allowed us to have this podcast episode conversation over a cup of tea in my apartment, in the guest room of my apartment. If you're going to like what you're hearing over the next 45 to, let's say 60 minutes, make sure to subscribe to Cities Reimagined on your favorite podcasting platform. Follow us on Instagram or shoot me an email at johannes@anthropocene.city or get connected on LinkedIn to me. All right, but now to the conversation I had with Donagh Horgan on urban tourism and much more. Donagh, thank you so much for coming over. I actually thought about having this conversation with you for a long time, and now you reached out that you're in Vienna, so it was the perfect time to have that. So thanks for coming over.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Donagh, you're Irish, right? And you're living in the Netherlands, but you speak so many different languages. What's your deal?
Well, I suppose what happened was that I'm the youngest of four children. So when I started in school, I could already speak English, and I was introduced to Irish, to Gaeilge, to our mother tongue, and it kind of changed my world. That there was this whole other language and way of, I suppose, understanding the world. So I really kind of embraced language at that stage, and when I chose to go to secondary school, I did my entire secondary schooling in Irish. So I had this very, very kind of strong basis of language. And then I went on Erasmus, and I thought that I could speak really good French when I arrived there, but after 3 months I could speak okay French. And then later in my career, I went to Russia, and Russia has some I suppose in the Russian language there's a lot of French in it. So I had this kind of line where I was able to and because it's also a very old language, I could kind of use Irish grammar to kind of construct Russian with some French words. And at that point, I realized that I had some sort of ability with languages.
Amazing.
So I now speak 8 languages.
I'm very jealous.
Really There's also maybe some sort of neurodiversity there, so don't need to be too jealous. But yeah, it's definitely it's an asset, and I think that it's something that allows me to communicate different concepts for different audiences. So it's not only in terms of being able to speak different languages with different people, but it helps me a lot conceptually also. And in terms of my understanding of how the world works in different ways.
You already mentioned that you lived in very different places. Tell us a little bit about that. What was your favorite city to be in?
It's funny because I was having this conversation with someone today, a Portuguese colleague from Lisbon, and we started speaking about São Paulo and how, I suppose, the street and how kind of place and how kind of organic things happen there. Certainly there's a whole kind of placemaking that happens at nighttime in São Paulo that's very organic. And I arrived in São Paulo from Buenos Aires, which is a very slightly up its own arse city. And coming to Brazil from that context and seeing this very open city where you can kind of do whatever you want, and there's a lot of tolerance, although there can be other problems there. I would say without a doubt that São Paulo is probably my favorite city in the world. I do have a soft spot for Cork, which is my own city. But I think that São Paulo has something of the laboratory where there's always something being cooked up.
São Paulo is an absolute crazy city.
Yes, it's great fun.
I've been there twice, and it's absolutely everything is kind of crazy about the city. It's so big. You need to go, or when you go to another place, you easily are in traffic for 2 hours.
Yes.
It's where did you live in São Paulo?
So I lived in Pinheiros, in Alto de Pinheiros, which is kind of slightly bougie kind of part of Pinheiros. Yeah. And then afterwards, when I suppose when I moved back there with my partner, we lived in Santa Cecilia, so in Centro, and very much in, I suppose, within the epicenter of kind of gentrification and gated communities coming up in the center. So essentially, when I was living there, it was like 2012, 2013, 2014. It was around the time of riots, and there were a lot of, I suppose, activism. There were a lot of different types of activism happening, and people were starting to reclaim rights to the city in São Paulo in a way that I think that was happening organically, but they were formalizing this. So it was a very, very exciting time to be there. Yeah. So when I was more in the center, I could feel that happening, right in front of me. So, for example, we were very close to an area called Higienópolis, which would be a very affluent part of São Paulo. And when I was there, I saw a cycle lane being laid through Higienópolis and then being deleted by the local populace who painted over it in black.
Okay.
So you really saw some kind of urban conflicts in at a really one-to-one scale there. At the same time, you saw kind of cycle lanes being used by, cartoneiros and people who were cleaning the streets, and it made you think of, the importance of infrastructure for different people. And I suppose the idea that someone could delete that or kind of like, turn it back into parking, for me, opened up a whole set of kind of questions about how urban governance takes place. So I think, even though I might have fun in places like Osaka or in Belgrade or, London's always good for fun, but São Paulo has a very special place in my heart.
How about Cork, your hometown? How did that shape your interest in cities, maybe?
Well, absolutely. So I think that Cork is very interesting because in Ireland, often people don't kind of recognize that we do have cities. And before we were colonized, we didn't inhabit in an urban context. So cities as urban settlements first came to us, and Cork is a Viking settlement. Was settled by Vikings, and then latterly the English. So it's a city, even though many people don't recognize it, even in Ireland. For example, if you think about European programs for cities, Ireland didn't participate because it seems to not recognize that it has a few cities outside of Dublin. So Cork was a very important place in the British Empire. Its kind of heyday was in the kind of 1700s, where milk products and human resources would have been brought to, for example, the Caribbean and other British colonies. So we have a lot of warehousing from that period and a lot of colonial and architectural buildings of interest, although we have a big problem with dereliction. And this isn't a new problem. So Cork has this kind of how would you say, like a kind of, it's the, it has this like underdog quality to it. So it calls itself the People's Republic. It has this kind of oppositional, slightly contrarian kind of position. At the same time, it's a city. It, in the 90s, it was like it had a big rave scene, for example. Kurt Cobain, like Nirvana, would have played in Cork.
Did he go?
Yeah, we actually, his family is from Cork. We have a very big Cork diaspora, So Cork was a place that, there was interesting things happening. At the same time, Cork saw no Celtic tiger. So we have this kind of, we have this slightly broken city that performs really as a retail core, but neglects all other kind of quality of life. So it's a very interesting place to grow up in. And I'm actually from the outskirts of the city. So where I'm from is now in the city. Only maybe 1 year ago it was incorporated into the city. But for example, in my childhood, and Ireland, alongside Portugal and Greece, was the poorest country in the EU at that time. There would have been grass growing down the center of the road, and it's now it's suburbs of the city. So I would have gone into town every Saturday and kind of roamed the city on my own and just kind of like discovered it. So I always had this urban perspective that was slightly different to others.
Did you have the urge to leave Cork then, to move to São Paulo and all these cities? Was it this smaller town? How do you say this experience of growing up in a smaller town which made you want to discover the world?
Well, absolutely. So around the time, I suppose, when I was a teenager, my sister used to live in London, and I had another sister in Dublin. So like when I was around maybe 11 or 12, my parents would put me on the train to Dublin. So I was independently able to go to Dublin. And so I didn't have a fear of cities in a way that other people did. So I would just discover on my own, like in a situationless way. And equally, I suppose, when I would go to London to visit my sister, I would have been, 15 or 16. And sometimes I would just say, I'm going to look and I'll, be back for you in 20 minutes. But I would actually go on the tube and I would go somewhere, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I've always had this kind of desire to explore cities. And I haven't felt in any way unsafe in cities, which people might do. And I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine and myself and another few people we were trying to start a conversation around an urban Gaeltacht in Dublin, so an urban Irish language speaking community. And I had this workshop, kind of mini focus group, and with young kind of protagonists of the Irish language world. And when we started to describe this concept to them, they were horrified, because still in Ireland, the concept of a city is something very dark, and it's associated with drugs and with crime, and the whole concept of the right to the city is not very present in Ireland, which could be also to do with our colonial past. And for example, the whole concept of policing comes from Ireland. So we haven't been naturally offered participation in city making.
Donagh, tell me a little bit about their work. You just before we started today, you just told me about your schedule for the next week, and that was already so much that tell us about that. That were so different things. What do you do?
So primarily, I suppose I am an academic practitioner. So my background is in architecture. I used to be an architect, and I left architecture because I became quite disillusioned with the profession, and I went into kind of a design thinking, service design area. And then I came out of that and I tried to do kind of strategic design work, but I was kind of a bit ahead of the curve. And I kind of realized that I needed to bring these things together myself before I could really make money from this. So I did a PhD, which was looking at social innovation systems for brilliant, resilient communities. And off the back of that, I was involved in some European projects, which brought me into a tourism context. So at the moment, I lead a living lab in Rotterdam, part of 2 living labs, Inholland accredited. And we look at societal transitions through the lens of urban leisure and tourism. So how can tourism play a positive role in society and offer entrepreneurship and other opportunities to local people? We, I suppose, follow a kind of new urban tourism paradigm, which does not differentiate significantly between visitors and locals, and essentially seeks out a quality of life for local people that can be attractive for visitors, be they just across the road or the other side of the tracks or from somewhere else. So most of my week is taken with academic research through the Living Lab. I also teach in Erasmus University Rotterdam on some master's programs, so cultural economics and entrepreneurship, tourism, culture and society, and also managing global art markets. And then if I didn't have enough, I do some small consultancy projects on the side of that, mostly in the urban context.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Let's stick with that. Let's stick with the urban tourism topic for a little. Because it seems like urban tourism is, in general, becoming more and more challenging for European cities as well. So a couple of weeks ago, I had a lecture in Lisbon, and at the University of Lisbon, at the Faculty of Arts, which is very, very central in the city. And it's close to it's just uphill from the city hall. And after that, we just went for a drink near the elevator. I think it's called Santa Elevadore Santa Justa.
Yeah.
And from there, there's a new bar. At least it was new to me. I didn't see it yet, and it's outside. And you overlook the old town, or you look down to the city center. And it was so striking how many people there were, how noisy it was. And all my colleagues who I was with, they told me about all the challenges it had with this mass tourism brought to them. So it could be that the cruise lines coming in, or the cruise ships, they just spit out thousands of people who are there for the day and then leave again. Or how the platform urbanism or Airbnb, how that has implications on the housing market. Tell us a little bit about that, about how did we get there, and what are the challenges?
Okay, so I suppose, and I came into this through working on a Horizon project looking at over-tourism called Smart Test, which had Lisboa, so Lisbon was a partner, but also Vienna, Barcelona, Venice, our own Amsterdam, and Edinburgh, which was a case that I led at the time, but didn't go through the final
so all
reporting.
Cities who are not shy of tourists.
Essentially, yes. But also Ljubljana, so cities that were essentially prone to, that were on the cusp of becoming over-touristed, or that could see that in their trajectory. To be honest, it all starts in 2008. So when the financial collapse happens, then cities use tourism as a way to fill their budgets, essentially, with new money, and then they become dependent on tourism and tourism monocultures. So if you take a city like Lisbon, for example, which was a case study in Smart Test, they at the time that we were doing that research weren't as touristed as they are now, but they were very well on their way to it. So there was no way that it was going any other way. And as part of that research, colleagues of mine in EGOC, which is the tourism kind of academic center there, they started to look at the whole question of retail gentrification in Lisbon, which was, for example, in some of the areas you were speaking there next to the elevator, which would have been historically streets that you would have a chaveiro, so where you would have got your keys cut, or you would have gone to get like a piece of copper to fix your toilet or something, that these were being replaced by hipster bars, primarily catering for digital nomads, that some of them would have been on golden visas in Portugal, or others would have just been there for a limited amount of time. So it starts with, I suppose, loss of local services, and then the whole proliferation of Airbnb and everything else then takes local people also out of the center. So the city centres become places that are really just for capital and tourism capital, which, as you described there, is very transient and might not even be overnight in some contexts. And then when you empty out the city centres, what you're left with is a very dangerous place. So, for example, in Edinburgh, which, as I said, was one of the cases that I was working on, but we didn't come to fruition in the end. I had interviews where people were describing kind of, tenement blocks where maybe 2 or 3 apartments were not Airbnb. So you essentially, as a resident, you walk in to your close, to your you open the door and you're faced with a set of locks.
Yeah.
You don't know who your neighbors are, if you have any that are still there. Again, there's a safety aspect. If we think about Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street,
Yeah.
if people are not living in city centres, then they become unsafe. And Barcelona, which was a case in Smart Test, and it's also a place where one of my best friends lives. And Edu, my best friend, lives in for example, the centre of the Barry Gothic, and observing that type of over-tourism from a local perspective is incredible. Not only the noise of the click-clack of the kind of trolleys kind of going across cobblestones, but also, for example, in where he used to live, he had an apartment over him that was rented out by 12 or 15 migrant workers, irregular migrant workers from Southeast Asia, who sold beer on the street, at nighttime, and they lived kind of 12 to 15 of them in that unit. So his entire night was people running up and down the stairs getting cans out of the fridge to sell on the street. So I think that we often neglect to think about the lived experience of over-tourism and what it actually means in practice. And it's not necessarily, too much noise on the bus, or, the loss of your local DIY store. There's some also really significant impacts in terms of and people have different coping abilities for these, especially older isolated people who don't have a lot of social capital, or, for example, don't have a lot of agency in decision making, can be quite isolated by these situations. So you see places like Krakow, for example, which are really now facing very, very negative impact from over-tourism in their city centre, and other parts of Poland that, are very on the cusp of that, So it's interesting because in Rotterdam, we understand this, and in the Netherlands, we have both of our living labs are in peripheral locations of the city, and we want to see, for example, if there are advantages to bringing tourists out into those locations, or if we're simply spreading the problem to potentially peripheral communities who have even less tools to deal with this. So it's a very dynamic context for research, and there is no real there aren't necessarily solutions appearing, but I think that it just means that we need to be much more, I suppose, provocative in our interventions, and try to test different ways of doing things.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a minute. But so I see that there's increasingly a tendency to see tourism or urban tourism either as good or bad. But where's the sweet spot? What would you say? Is there something you can? Is there a sweet spot, or is it a matter of perspective? Is it a matter of your own interest, as in what kind of stakeholder group, or what is your stake in the urban tourism industry?
It really comes down to urban governance, unfortunately. So none of these problems are without a policy, solutions, or they're often emergent from policy. So the relationship to policy is significant, and often, we don't make that connection. So you see, for example, protests in the Balearics or in the Canaries that are happening, which are really protests against local governments in those areas. But they're being interpreted by media and press as anti-tourism movements, which is simply not the case, because those populations recognize the economic value of tourism. They just want better tourism, and a kind of more responsible and more respectful type of tourism that isn't extractive. So even though my background is in architecture, I suppose I've become quite accustomed with literature and tourism, and for example, really it's about putting the kind of the emphasis on local people and allowing them to have a voice, and also allowing them to produce tourism. So you have concepts which is called tourism leakage that exists in tourism when you have very big actors within the ecosystem that take all the benefit. So I think it's about, in the same way as any of the other urban conflicts that we have around mobility, around gentrification, around potentially kind of commercial urban development, all these are rooted in urban governance and policy. And at the end of the day, if we think that we are building commons infrastructure for future generations, or if we're just trying to extract value at the moment in 2025. So without sounding like, a kind of raving Marxist, it comes back down to the capitalist systems that we're operating in. And unfortunately, if we think about European cities that are facing over-tourism at a European level, and I'm a European through and through. In Ireland, we are very, very supportive of European mechanisms, but the kind of lean into neoliberalism that happens at the European policy level, and that encourages outsourcing and the attrition of public value across the entire system, is very negative. And it doesn't only play out in tourism, but in other areas too. But because tourism has more of a voice, we hear it.
Tell me a little bit about the public value related to tourism, what you just mentioned.
Okay, so I suppose, and this is a bigger question, not only related to tourism, but I think that I might give you an example of a place that we haven't spoken about that is quite over-touristed. So Dublin, for example, is a really big tourist place. People come to drink Guinness, to go to the storehouse, to, try to find leprechauns or whatever they do in Ireland. And we have a lot of tourism. And we also have a lot of migration to Ireland. So even though, as I spoke about before, we were kind of on the peripheral of European kind of periphery of European economic success up until the kind of 90s, we're now at the top. So we have, I suppose, between 12 and 15% non-national population. So tourism in Ireland is delivered by Polish or Croatian or Brazilian staff. So already there's interactions between tourism and mobility there. And when you think about the platformization of tourism and of other services like food, for example, and hospitality, so Airbnb, but also Deliveroo and Uber Eats and all these things, they're also, for example, would be predominantly Brazilians or Southeast Asians that participate in this. And so there is a kind of a level of exploitation within the system that's tolerated, and that is kind of displacing value from something to the other, so the value between the customer and the product is kind of removed. And in the tourism context, for example, there's nothing wrong in Ireland with Polish or Ukrainians delivering tourism, but it should be authentic and it should represent what Ireland looks like today in 2025, which is diverse and which isn't, Aran sweaters and sheep and fields and kind of like, So I think it's about creating opportunities where people can be themselves and have agency, and so can tell their own story, or that they can, for example, create tourism experiences that are authentic, and that can exercise direct value from those. And the opposite is, for example, the same red bus tour that,
Yeah, you can do it all around the world.
Absolutely. And it's pretty much following a very similar kind of route and set of attractions, and telling a very superficial story where there is profit being generated. And it's not insignificant, but it's, again, going to potentially a multinational. And we see this also with hotels and with the platform that you mentioned. So I think that a community kind of a tourism that has value for the community is also producing good for that community. And that doesn't have to be in a very, very superficial way. So, for example, Copenhagen is a city that's very good about talking about its kind of localhood and how its tourism is at the neighborhood level. But how sincere that is remains to be seen. So, for example, they would say that in Copenhagen that you can perform citizenship by, being as green as a local Copenhagener and, helping them kind of collect rubbish, kind of, So, and that to me seems like a very performative type of community tourism that doesn't really benefit anyone. Potentially Veolia, or one of the outsourced kind of waste management environmental service organizations that is doing this on behalf of the city, that might have to pick up less, although a city might have to pay kind of penalty if into a PPP.
But it's also a kind of city branding strategy, or
absolutely
for Copenhagen, probably we're a green city. We will
completely, and we like to cycle everywhere, and so it's kind of there's almost a dual performativity there that's happening, and in a way the tourist is being is performing that on their behalf. Also, so they're also kind of outsourcing this brand management to the tourists. So it takes all responsibility out of the system, also in terms of being able to do more responsible tourism. And it would be very, very hard to not look at that as a system, or even as an ecosystem, and understand it in a neoliberal context. That, again, and if you read kind of Mazzucato or anyone who writes about, for example, public value creation, and we think about someone like Elon Musk, whose innovation is all derived from public funding for the most part at a significant level, who is at the same time telling the story about how public value isn't created in local government or in the civil service, which might have resonated at some point, but I think now, given the transparency that exists around some of these systems, that cannot be said to be the case, and we will see real collapse as a result of this in the States. So I think that we need to be really, really mindful about where we're going here, not only in tourism, but kind of in general. And if we think back to the context of the city itself really should be a platform or a resource to allow people reach their highest potential, and that's what a city is for. It allows the ideas to coalesce. It's a kind of social condenser for different policy thoughts, different ideas, different experiments that can happen, and I suppose the further that urban governance is wrested from citizens themselves, and that is kind of given to systems with no accountability that are essentially designed through neoliberal mechanisms, then we really lose out. And it's not just us now that lose out, but future generations also.
Donagh, you mentioned before that you try, or in your work you try out you test different, let's say, avenues on urban tourism, or you look at that. You also work on regenerative tourism. What does that actually mean in practice? Why does it interest you, and how does that address all the challenges we just mentioned?
Okay, so I suppose regenerative tourism and regenerative paradigms in general are about trying to make situations better than they are today. So kind of restoring relationships with natural ecosystems between different people, very much following a kind of renewal, place-based approach that allows value to be co-created, kind of in the way that I was just speaking about. So this requires different domains of knowledge. It can't be led, for example, by any one knowledge domain. It requires kind of that you develop iterative frameworks that are not fixed, that can be revised, and that are essentially iterative by their nature, and that these facilitate testing and prototyping of different ways of doing things. And all of this, in a way, should result in an architecture, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense, that is different, and that I suppose produces more socio-spatial equity than we have at the moment. So if we think about, like in terms of examples of regenerative tourism, a lot of this is happening, I suppose, equally in post-colonial contexts where tourism is reflective of enduring unequal situations where, for example, tourism is a monoculture in the same way that sugar production or tobacco might have been in the past. So if you can think about those societies, and during COVID, for example, in the work that I do with Bloomberg, I worked with Montego Bay, Jamaica. And Montego Bay, for example, during COVID had a significant problem because most of and the entire island of Jamaica, in fact, a lot of it doesn't produce a lot because as a colonial ecosystem, it was just about extractive, cultivation. So it needs to import everything. And if visitors aren't coming, or tourists aren't coming, or others aren't coming to the island, then none of the other produce are coming to the island. So if you think about engaging in a regenerative perspective with that type of tourism, for example, in the Caribbean, it's about restoring relationships between those people and natural environments, allowing maybe considering that tourism is a monoculture, allowing other industries to grow up against that are synergetic, maybe kind of agri-food, for example. Also about restoring relationships in terms of in terms of governance. So who has a right to controlling or developing assets and the use of natural assets, and also social capital that's generated in community. And maybe putting decision-making power back in the hands of community. So, for example, you mentioned there, and we were talking about a city that is seeking to, like Copenhagen, that's seeking to seek visitors based on its green profile. But in a way, it should be the citizens themselves that tell that story, and that should be an outcome of how the citizens work, because otherwise it's slightly insincere. So I feel that even DMOs, so destination management organizations, should have a much more interaction with citizenry and less so with commercial actors only, because that story should come from the bottom up. And I think that beginning with storytelling and narrative, that we can create different ways of doing things and different systems that where value does genuinely trickle down, even though I'm not a fan of that type of language, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but staying with that notion a little bit, can you ensure somehow that this, let's say, value change, that the money which comes in from tourism into a neighborhood or into a city, that it doesn't end up in a multinational business, or leaves the neighborhood immediately, this extractive character you mentioned before? Are there ways, or can you think of good examples where cities have, or neighborhoods have, succeeded in creating an ecosystem or an environment that the money stays local and benefits the whole community?
So there are some good examples. Like if you look to, for example, Mexico, I think in the city of Oaxaca, there's community managed tourism, full service kind of entities that are essentially a community integrated hotel that would allow visitors to be embedded within a community setting and be fed and clothed and everything else kind of by community organizations, and for that benefit to stay there. You see it sometimes, for example, with tours that it would have been in Soweto and in South Africa, that initially would have been very much of the community, but as popularity grows and competition comes in, you see that commercial actors enter into even these things. I think that there are great examples around the world, but also I think that not one size fits all. So cities are as diverse as human beings, and I think that, and even within cities, neighborhoods are as diverse as humans. So what works in one place might not necessarily work in the other, and that, I think, is an opportunity as much as a challenge. And it kind of underscores why we need to be place-based in everything that we do.
Tell me a little bit about what you said before about the let's say, spreading of tourists to different neighborhoods. I think you mentioned your work in Rotterdam there.
So actually, Rotterdam, I suppose, it's somewhere that isn't over touristed, and I think that the city is seeking to kind of bring, because it can do something differently than the tourism that happens in Amsterdam, that it's already starting to kind of look at localism in a different way. And this really is because of the type of tourism that happens in Amsterdam. And if we look at Amsterdam as as what we don't want, we can also see some of the problems with spreading. So I collaborated with kind of my counterpart in our Amsterdam Living Lab, Rose Gerritsma, on a chapter which was looking at pride in Amsterdam and the potential of spreading pride to suburbs and what that might look like as a kind of way to manage over tourism and other mega kind of events. And what we kind of found out there is that obviously some of the kind of more less city centres, some of the more peripheral neighbourhoods of Amsterdam, in terms of their composition and in terms of how they work, aren't necessarily going to be super welcoming to events like Pride. And that we really need to be very careful in terms of how we plan spreading. So I would have interviewed a kind of social anthropologists as part of that project, and they would have said that, for example, in order to allow something like Pride to be spread to outer neighborhoods of Amsterdam, you need to give agency to essentially queer communities that exist in those communities. So, for example, if you have potentially, queer Turkish or Moroccan communities, by allowing them to exercise agency in their own community, then you can build Pride up in the neighborhood level, and then it can take spreading. How it happens at the moment is very top down. So you have, for example, in order to get some tourists out of Amsterdam and going to Zaandam, they renamed Zaandam Amsterdam Beach, which isn't potentially very nice to people in Zaandam who have a very, very different social history and kind of pride around their place. Like equally, if we started calling Hoek van Holland Rotterdam Beach, we would get some pushback, kind of, So we have to forget that communities have their own stories and they have their own desires, and we should allow active listening. It's really important, and this takes time. The type of stuff that happens in living labs or in kind of in settings where co-creation is required is slow. You get participation fatigue, you get suspicion. Like, for example, where we're working in Rotterdam Zuid has very low trust. It's like less than 20% voter turnout. So you're trying to kind of speak to people about the opportunity of tourism in that kind of context when they don't really trust any actors involved in city decision making. That can be a kind of tall order sometimes.
Donagh, before I let you go and follow your busy agenda for the rest of the week, what are 3 advices you would give to anybody working on reimagining their cities?
So this is something that I looked at as part of my own kind of doctoral research, and in terms of generating social innovation in the built environment and at the city level, the first thing is very much around engagement. So engage, network early and often. And this is advice to, I suppose, people involved with urban governance, but also people at the activism kind of level who are trying to effect change. So network, make alliances with others, cross-sectoral, and do that early and often, as soon as you notice that there is something that you need to address. So don't wait until it comes to you, go to it. And then the second thing, I suppose, is about the whole concept of not seeking an end point. So we spoke before about how kind of frameworks and strategies can be iterative, and I think that we need to kind of maybe work in a wiki way where kind of we can bring together different domains of knowledge in an interim context before we've arrived at the destination, and that we can kind of continue to think and test and prototype and all those things that we were talking about previously within that. And then I think that in terms of what emerges from that, and I mentioned it before, and I refer to it as architecture. And when I speak about architecture, it's not exclusively the built environment, but also policy architecture and the architecture of services. And I think this needs to be devolved. So the whole kind of context of community asset transfer and community management of commons, and there is a concept of a tourism commons that I'm really working hard to develop with other partners, and hopefully seek funding to do so. And I think that this, in terms of how the community manages assets and resources going forward, we need to look at how previous societies did this. So, for example, before we were colonized in Ireland, so the kind of in the Gaelic system, we had a type of proto-socialism that would redistribute housing, for example, every 3 years based on community needs. And how decision making would happen in that context was by assembly. So we would have some like fairs. So like the Irish for fair is Éanach, which means unity. It means like one. It means something where someone would different components would come together. They would do decision making through music, through dance, through arts and culture, which is something that we are trying to get involved with in our living labs. They would unpack decisions, and then they would agree policy, which would then be taken back to communities and interpreted at the local level. So nothing was centralized, which is very, very different to how Ireland operates now in a post-colonial context. So everything was place-based. Even the loosest policy would come back, and that would be debated and interpreted at the local level. So I think that we should look at how previous systems used to work around these. Like, for example, in the early 2000s and in the 90s, we a lot of the kind of good things that existed in socialist states in Eastern Europe, we were very, very much too quick to get rid of, and I think it's worth reconsidering some of these systems. And equally, kind of like, places like Yugoslavia, which had a very, very different approach, who had market socialism that tried to marry these things, arguably not very well, but, had some really great policy mechanisms around decision-making and how people participated in urban governance. And we really need to look back at some of this self-management.
Donagh, thanks so much. What is next for you this week? What's happening the next days?
So for me, over the next few days, we have some. I'm here for a BIP, so a blended intensive program looking at caring for the city, which is hosted by FHVN, and as part of that, we will be engaging with some stakeholders that are working on DUT projects here. Obviously, I collaborate with them in Rotterdam also. So looking at some of that, then I will dip in and out of some URBACT programs, and then this weekend I go to Sofia to speak about urban activation from the perspective of our living lab with Collectiva, which is a collective looking at spatial transformation in Sofia and cities in Bulgaria. So,
busy days ahead.
No rest for the wicked, as we say in Ireland.
Thank you so much for coming over. Thank you for coming to my apartment. It's the first podcast episode I record at home, so I hope you liked it.
Absolutely. I feel very much at home here.
A working room, guest room, and a podcast studio for
Fantastic.
now.
Well, you'll have to drag me out of it because I'll be wanting to sleep there.
Go ahead. You need the rest for the next days. Donagh, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Shin.
That's it for today. If you liked what you heard, make sure you subscribe to Cities Reimagined on your favorite podcasting channel. Follow us on Instagram or get connected on LinkedIn or drop me an email at johannes@anthropocene.city. There's more exciting stuff coming out on Cities Reimagined in the next weeks and months, and I really hope to catch you soon.